When I saw my husband scrolling through my phone, my heart lurched, not out of fear of being caught, but because of those messages. The ones I forgot to delete. I reached for the phone on reflex, but he pulled back with a quick, practiced motion and kept reading. I watched his face change line by line, the muscles around his mouth tightening, his eyes narrowing as he moved from one thread to the next, and I felt how my life could tilt off its axis in a matter of seconds. Yes, he would learn the truth now. But not the whole truth. His fingers trembled as he flicked further, and I knew he was getting close to the message that could end everything. The single one that would make sense of the past months and also tangle them beyond repair. My phone buzzed in his hands, the screen lighting with a new notification. I saw the color drain from his face as he read the sender's name. He froze. He didn't blink. I bit the inside of my cheek, a habit from years ago that returns whenever I'm nervous. My nerves braided with the cold knowledge of what I had done. His breathing grew shallow. I could hear it from across the room, 2 meters and a lifetime between us. This was exactly the moment I had dreaded. Because 3 months ago, I made a mistake, one that changed everything, and now I stood there empty-handed, with nothing to do but tell you how it really happened. Before I share the secret I tried so carefully to bury, tell me something. Have you ever guarded a truth with all your strength only to watch it spill out anyway? Have you ever thought you were protecting a life when in fact you were only delaying the collapse? The first nail I drove, that spring bent under my grip and skittered across the hardwood like a silver fish. It made a bright, guilty sound. I picked it up and straightened it on the windowsill with the handle of a screwdriver, as if you could press something crooked back into honesty. Outside, the noon heat wavered over the driveway. The city hummed with the slow persistence of people who had errands to run and places to be. Inside, our house smelled of old paint and lemon cleaner, a fragrance I once found reassuring. Lately it only reminded me of routines that had become muscle memory: wash the mugs, buff the counter, silence the quiet between us with a soft cloth. My husband loved schedules. He loved them the way other people loved dogs or music. Monday calls. Tuesday invoices. Wednesday meetings. He loved structure because it held his world still. I had loved that once, too. There is a particular safety in a life that runs on oiled hinges. But hinges rust if they're never opened, they seize, then creak, then sound like complaint. That was what our evenings had become, careful steps around a creaking thing. We weren't unhappy. We were intact, unexamined, a house whose windows had not been washed in a decade. From the street, it looked fine. The repair began with a list. He placed it on the table between us, folding the paper into crisp halves, a white flag no one waved. He can help, my husband said. He's between projects. It will be good for him. He meant his nephew by marriage. I had met him twice, holidays where people ate too much and collected names on napkins. He was polite in a way that suggested he practiced it. He listened, which is rarer than it should be. At those gatherings, he had asked me about the garden and then actually waited for the answer. I noticed the waiting. People who listen have a way of making you feel like a window has been opened in your chest. He's an adult, my husband added, as if anticipating resistance. He's done this kind of work. We could save money. I'll transfer the funds for materials. I nodded because it was practical. Practicality is the rope that keeps you from falling when you're not yet ready to ask why you keep walking along a ledge. The day he arrived, he was a few minutes early. He stood on the porch with a paper bag of muffins and a box of contractor bags balanced on his hip. The morning light made a fine halo out of the dust in the air. He knocked and then stepped back the way considerate people do, leaving room for whoever opens the door to feel unthreatened. I remember the heat licking the back of my neck and the bird calls threaded through the neighborhood. I remember thinking that our porch rail needed sanding and how we had said that for 3 years. Morning, he said. I brought fuel and trash. He lifted the muffins, then the bags, a small choreography of offering. Good choices, I said, and I meant both. We walked through the house with the list. The hallway baseboards that had known too many shoes. The kitchen cabinet that sagged on tired hinges. The loose banister post that wobbled like a drunk confession. He moved his hand along the banister, testing its give, the way you might test the honesty of a story. He didn't talk much. When he did, it was to ask questions that made a room specify itself. Do you use this door more than the other? Is the afternoon light strong here? How much storage do you wish you had? Each answer felt like a small admission. I discovered that the kitchen light was too white, that the hallway made me feel examined, that I had longed for a shelf by the back door to set down my keys the second I walked in. We started with the hallway. It needed patching, sanding, repainting, work that creates the illusion of erasing time. While he laid out drop cloths, I mixed spackle in a plastic tub with a wooden stick. He moved in clean, economical lines, and there was something soothing about watching someone who knows how to take a room apart and put it back together. The house responded to that competence. The air itself sat straighter. I learned the weight of the putty knife and the patience it asked for. You can't force a wall to smooth. You have to lay the paste and wait. You have to trust that what looks messy will dry into a plane you can sand into something honest. I thought about marriage then, and whether I had ever given it that kind of patience, or whether I had only learned to decorate over hairline cracks, hanging art where I didn't want to look. We didn't talk about feelings. We talked about corners and grit and the best way to keep dust from sifting under the door. He showed me how to tape off the edges so paint lines would be crisp. I showed him where the house always swallowed light in late afternoon. We took our coffee standing at the kitchen counter. He drank his black, I put too much milk in mine. The radio murmured a station that played old songs with cheerful lies in them. I caught him humming once, a soft thread under the sound of sandpaper. It made me smile without meaning to. There are small intimacies you don't notice until you stand in the doorway later and catalog what changed. Passing a screwdriver hand to hand. Sharing a trash bag and not letting the wind bloom it open. Catching the same drip of paint on the edge of the can. They're not confessions. They're agreements. The house overheard us and stayed quiet. At noon, my husband called to check on progress. He wanted units and measurements, not textures. I gave him the summary he preferred: 2 coats planned, baseboards tomorrow, materials well within budget. He sounded pleased, the way people sound when their vision is obeyed by the world. Before he hung up, he said, "This is good for him," meaning his nephew, but also, I suspected, meaning him. Work is cure. Work is proof that nothing is wrong if something is being fixed. In the afternoon, we moved to the kitchen, where the cabinet door had long drooped like a tired eyelid. He unpinned the hinge and set the screws in a neat line on the counter. I watched the patience in his hands. There are people who try to dominate a hinge and people who coax it. He coaxed. My own hands, too used to keys, lists, receipts, wanted to help, so I held the door steady and felt the weight of it in my arms. It was heavier than it looked. Most things are. You okay? He asked once, noticing the way I shifted to keep from dropping it. I'm fine, I said, and the words felt both true and false. I was fine in the way a chair is fine until someone actually sits in it and it reveals a wobble. We finished the cabinet and put the bowls back on the shelf. It is a particular pleasure to see a corrected line, wood that no longer sags, a door that closes without pleading. I closed it 3 times in a row, just to hear the soft click. He grinned at the sound like a kid who had solved a puzzle. The grin made him look younger, but not fragile. People love to pretend that competence and kindness are different muscles. In him they braided into something that felt like steadiness. He left at 5 with a list for the hardware store and a plan for the next day. We stood on the porch again like polite actors at the end of a scene. A neighbor waved from the sidewalk, and somewhere on the block a dog barked at a mail carrier. Everyday noises, county-issue life. He thanked me for the coffee. I thanked him for the cabinet. He said, tomorrow, the baseboards, and the word tomorrow felt larger than its dictionary size. After he left, I walked through the rooms alone. The hallway looked raw, patched, taped, prepped for paint. It was beautiful in its honesty, stripped of its performances. In the kitchen, I opened and closed the cabinet door twice more and then laughed at myself. I set the dinner plates out, moved the radio to the far end of the counter, and put my phone on the charger near the window where the afternoon light fades first. We ate late, my husband and I, because he had brought home a stack of papers with deadlines clinging to them. He told me about a contract dispute in a voice that had 3 speeds: polite, firm, final. I told him the hallway would be primed tomorrow, and the baseboards might need replacing altogether. He said, do what's most efficient, which is the kind of sentence that can apply to paint or to pain. We cleared the dishes, and he returned to his laptop, his face lit by the blue geometry of spreadsheets. I took my book to the sofa and read the same sentence 6 times before giving up. In bed, the ceiling fan ticked like an old metronome. I lay awake and listened to the night dividing itself into smaller nights. The smell of dust lingered on my skin, a faint instruction to keep going. I wondered when we had last stood side by side and examined something we both wanted to mend. Marriage is not a wall, you can't sand it and paint it and expect it to behave. But love, like plaster, expects a hand. It expects someone to touch it long enough to learn where it resists and where it yields. In the morning I tied my hair back with a paint-speckled ribbon I found in the junk drawer. I opened the window in the hallway to let the new day in, and the air slipped around me with the relief of cold water. He arrived exactly on time, with the easy way of people who mean to be useful and not noticed. We said good morning. We didn't say anything else that might tip the room out of balance. We didn't need to. The house had a list. We had work. And there are some stories that begin not with confession, but with a straightened nail laid carefully on a windowsill, waiting for its second chance. The ladder shifted before either of us was ready. A rubber foot slid across the hallway drop cloth with a quiet, traitorous sigh, and the paint tray lurched just enough to make a white arc across the primed wall. I caught the railing out of instinct, he caught the ladder, the tray settled with a slap that sounded like a boundary being put back where it belonged. I felt the jolt in my ribs. Hooks come in different shapes, some are accidents, and I knew the day had already chosen its angle. We steadied everything and then ourselves. The air held the chalky smell of primer and the faint sweetness of the muffins he had brought the day before. Morning pushed through the open window in a square of pale light that fell across his shoulders, dust stirring in it like snow that had changed its mind about falling. I told myself to breathe. The house was different today, and not because of the paint, it was a room that knew it was being watched. Work is a good disguise for nerves. We started with the baseboards, measuring, marking, negotiating the stubborn places where old wood refuses to admit time has passed. He handed me the pencil, I drew the hash marks, the tape measure snapped back into its case with a sound I felt in my teeth. I tried to keep the movements efficient, neutral, the choreography of 2 people who share a task and nothing else. Under the rhythm of sanding, however, there was a second rhythm, a small drum behind my breastbone. We kept our conversation in the narrow lane of tools and angles. He said we should undercut the trim near the bathroom where the tile rose like a tide. I said the hallway would look longer if we kept the paint line level with the light switch plates. He grinned and said, almost to himself, that a straight line was a kindness in a crooked house. The sentence stayed with me longer than it should have. I realized then how starved I had been for words that met me in the middle. Around mid-morning we drove to the hardware store for quarter round and finish nails. The truck smelled like dust and sun-warmed vinyl. I set the list on my knees and tried not to look at his hands on the wheel. Traffic made the trip slower than necessary. The city had decided to practice patience on our behalf. We talked about nothing on purpose. He asked if the rosemary in the garden survived winter. I told him it did if I covered it with a clay pot on the coldest nights. He nodded like this was the kind of fact worth keeping. In the aisle with the trim, he crouched to sight the lengths, his eye closing, his arm extended, a quiet geometry of attention. I stood at the end of the row, watching the line of his forearm, the deliberate way he rejected the boards with warps so slight I could barely see them. "These two," he said finally, and I carried them like something ceremonial while he paid. On the way back, a song I loved years ago came on the radio, and I realized I still knew the harmony. I did not sing. Back home, we worked more quickly. The body learns the logic of a tool if you let it. I could feel the set of the nail before the hammer found it. He trimmed the quarter round with a miter saw on the porch where neighbors sometimes slow their walking just to be part of a sound. The small triangles of waste fell like pale confetti. Every time I brought a cut length inside, the house seemed to settle further into its own skin. At lunch, we stood at the counter with slices of bread and tomatoes that tasted honest. I wiped a drop of juice from my wrist and felt, absurdly, like I had been caught doing something private. He pointed to the radio. "Too loud?" he asked. "It's fine," I said. The kitchen clock ticked a patient beat between us. My husband texted that a meeting had been moved. He would be home later than planned. I answered with a thumbs up and then set the phone screen down, as if that could quiet it. In the afternoon the heat rose, and the house narrowed into corridors of workable shade. We moved in and out of those corridors like swimmers finding the current. The hallway demanded a last sanding pass before paint. He knelt to check the lower edge, and I held the lamp so the raking light would show flaws. He looked up once to align the beam with his hand and said, softly, that this made it easier. I held the light steady and thought of how long it had been since anyone told me how to help them well. When the first coat went on, the wall accepted it like relief. The brush made a sound I had not known I missed, a hush that says change is possible in thin, even layers. I edged the trim while he rolled the larger fields. Our shoulders brushed once when we traded places. We apologized at the same time and then laughed because saying sorry for contact is how civilized people deny the weather in their own bodies. We cleaned the brushes in the laundry sink and watched the water go milky. He asked whether the banister post should be tightened today or tomorrow, and I said tomorrow, because today had already taken enough. He nodded, and the nod felt like a pact not to outrun ourselves. The afternoon folded its light and set it on the windowsill like a note. Near 5, we returned to the section where the ladder had slipped. The arc of paint looked like a smile that did not belong to anyone in the room. He steadied the ladder with his foot and touched the rail with his hand, testing for a wobble that was no longer there. I climbed 2 steps to feather the edge back into the field. The brush in my hand felt heavier than a brush should feel. He stood close because the hallway is narrow and because some distances are facts, not choices. I reached for the tray, and our hands met on the metal lip. Not the back of a hand, not a brushed sleeve, palm to palm on something that required both of us to hold it. We did not move. The world narrowed to the weight we were sharing, to the warm press where his lifeline crossed mine. I heard a car pass outside and a dog bark and a pigeon complain from the roofline and knew, with a clarity that did not ask permission, that my life had been too quiet for too long. We set the tray down, not because we chose restraint, but because you cannot hold the same object forever. I stepped down from the ladder. The hallway seemed shorter, or maybe I was finally standing in it as myself. He said my name, almost a question, and I shook my head because there are moments you cannot name without breaking them. I looked at him, he looked back, the house held its breath with us. We kissed. The word is small for what it carried. It was not a plan, it was not an argument, it was a point on a map I had not admitted I was drawing. We stepped apart with the gentle surprise of people who have realized they can no longer pretend geography is only lines on paper. I picked up the brush again because hands crave tasks when the heart startles. He checked the ladder again because good habits are the last to leave. By the time we finished the last pass, the light had thinned to a pale ribbon. We cleaned up in silence that did not punish. He stacked the drop cloths, I capped the paint, we left the hallway to dry and stood at the kitchen doorway like travelers who had returned from the same country and could not yet say what it had asked of them. He left at 6 with a short wave. I watched him go and then walked back to the ladder to run my finger along the newly smoothed wall. The paint was still tacky. I pressed until it almost took my fingerprint, then lifted my hand and let the surface hold its smoothness. Some things you leave alone because touching them again would ruin the finish. I turned off the lamp and listened to the house decide what it would remember. The morning after the kiss, I moved slower than usual. The kettle hissed, but I let it sit longer before pouring. Outside, the early light had a metallic edge, as if the day was holding back. My hands went through the motions, mug, spoon, coffee, but my mind replayed the moment in the hallway. I tried to file it away under accidents or things that don't count, but nothing about it felt like a mistake you could ignore. I wondered if he would arrive the same way he always did or if the air between us would announce itself before either of us spoke. He showed up with the same steady knock, a folded receipt for hardware in one hand, a small container of wood filler in the other. His voice was casual when he greeted me, but I could feel the care in his tone, the way you check a railing before putting your weight on it. We didn't mention yesterday. The silence was practical, like covering fresh paint to protect it. We had work to do, and work is the best kind of alibi. The hallway baseboards needed sanding before the second coat. The scent of yesterday's paint still hung in the air, softened overnight but not gone. He ran his fingertips along the dried surface, checking for any unevenness, and I felt my pulse rise at the simple precision of the gesture. I knelt to start on the lower edges, the grit of the sandpaper thrumming against my palm, the repetitive motion forcing my thoughts into rhythm. Above me, I could hear him measuring cuts for the final pieces of trim, the tape measure snapping back like a punctuation mark. By mid-morning, we were in the truck again, heading to a supply store for the last batch of materials. The road was busier than usual, and every stoplight felt like an interval we didn't know how to fill. We talked about the list, screws, caulk, a better brush for cutting corners, but our sentences were shorter, trimmed down to essentials. I watched the way he leaned into turns, his forearm steady, and thought about how quickly some things become familiar. I kept my eyes on the passing storefronts, pretending to read the signs. At the store, we moved easily through the aisles, finding what we needed without debate. He checked the straightness of the boards with the same patience as before, rejecting any that warped or bowed. I carried the chosen ones to the register, the weight balanced against my shoulder. It struck me how much of the last few days had been about carrying lumber, paint, tools, and other things we couldn't name but felt just as heavy. Back home, the afternoon light shifted through the open front door, pooling in warm shapes on the floor. We set to work installing the new trim, him cutting and me holding each piece in place while he nailed it down. The sharp tap of the hammer was a rhythm we shared, brief bursts of sound in an otherwise quiet house. Each finished length felt like closing a chapter, measured, cut, fitted, secured. I brushed away sawdust with my fingertips, leaving clean lines behind. We stopped for coffee, standing at opposite ends of the counter. He asked if I thought the color in the hallway would look different once the light fixtures were replaced. I said it would, that softer light might make the space feel wider. He nodded and looked past me, toward the doorway, as if imagining it. That shared act, picturing the same space, altered, carried a quiet intimacy I hadn't expected. It was the kind of moment you can't explain to anyone else because there's nothing dramatic to point to, only the knowledge that you were both in the same place, thinking the same thing. In the late afternoon, we tackled the loose banister post. The joint had been wobbly for years, something I had stopped noticing until he pointed it out on the first day. Now we took it apart together, laying out the screws and brackets in neat rows. He tightened each connection with deliberate turns, the wood creaking slightly as it realigned. I held the base steady, feeling the vibrations through my hands. When it was done, the post stood solid, the way it must have when the house was new. The sound of my husband's car in the driveway came earlier than I expected. I felt a quick shift inside, as if the air had to rearrange itself in seconds. He walked in with a stack of folders and a distracted smile, asking how the day had gone. I gave him the facts: trim installed, post fixed, supplies bought, and he seemed satisfied, already moving toward his desk. There was no reason for him to suspect anything. There had been no open defiance, no obvious crossing of lines. But my own awareness of yesterday's moment felt like a shadow stretching across the floor. As evening came, I moved through the hallway alone, running my fingertips along the smooth trim, the even surface of the walls. Each change we had made was visible, tangible. But the other change, the one I couldn't measure or sand smooth, lived in the spaces between tasks, in the glance over a piece of lumber, the weight of something handed from one palm to another, the way silence can fill a room without feeling empty. After dinner, I stood on the porch with my tea, watching the last light bleed out of the sky. He had left an hour earlier, his tools stacked neatly by the wall for tomorrow. The air smelled faintly of cut wood and paint. I thought about how many small choices had led here, agreeing to the repairs, opening the door that first morning, letting the conversation stretch a little further each day. It was all so ordinary, yet the shape of it had changed everything. When I finally went back inside, the house felt different, though I knew every wall, every corner. It wasn't just the repairs, it was the awareness that there was now a before and an after, even if no one else could see the line. Upstairs, I could hear my husband's voice on a call, steady and measured. I turned off the hallway light, letting the shadows settle in, and felt the weight of the day still in my hands. Some things you build piece by piece without realizing you're building them at all. By the fourth day, the house had begun to smell of progress. Layers of primer and paint had replaced the faint mustiness that had lingered in corners, and even the air seemed straighter, as if the walls stood taller now. I woke earlier than usual, restless, and wandered into the hallway barefoot. The morning light had found the new trim and was tracing it like a deliberate signature. I let my fingertips follow the same path, feeling the clean, sharp edges where yesterday there had been worn-down wood. He arrived with a coil of extension cord over one shoulder and a small paper bag balanced in the crook of his arm. Inside were 2 cinnamon rolls from the bakery down the street, the kind you could smell before you opened the bag. He set them on the counter without comment, as though it were just another supply. We ate standing up, the quiet between us shaped more by what wasn't being said than by the scrape of forks. I noticed he had a faint smear of dried paint on his forearm, the color from our last session in the hallway. It felt like a detail I shouldn't know but did. The day's work began in the garden, clearing the narrow path to the shed so we could get to the old sawhorses. The grass was damp with early dew, and clippings stuck to my shoes. He worked ahead of me, lifting branches that had drooped into the walkway, tossing them into a growing pile. The air smelled of cut stems and soil. In the quiet, I realized how long it had been since I had moved my body in ways that weren't purely functional, stooping, hauling, carrying, but with an undercurrent of intent that wasn't just about the task. The shed door stuck the way it always had, and it took both of us leaning in to make it yield. Dust lifted in the beam of light that fell from the single high window, and the sawhorses stood in the corner, draped in an old tarp like they were hiding. We carried them out together, one on each end, adjusting our steps to keep pace. It wasn't heavy work, but it was the kind of movement that makes you aware of another person's rhythm, the way they shift their weight, when they slow, when they push ahead. Once the sawhorses were set up, we laid out the boards for the porch repair. The rail along the far side had weathered unevenly, some sections grayed to silver, others splintered where water had pooled. He measured each board with quick, precise marks, while I held the end of the tape in place. The sun had climbed enough to make the back of my neck warm, and the sound of the saw was a steady hum under the chatter of sparrows in the hedges. We worked without much conversation, just the occasional practical word, length, angle, hold. Every so often our hands met when passing a piece of wood, fingers brushing over the same rough grain. Each time it happened, I found myself cataloging the detail without meaning to: the warmth of skin, the callus at the base of his thumb, the brief pause before one of us let go. None of it was intentional, but all of it was noticed. By midday, the new boards were in place, the porch rail straighter and more solid than it had been in years. We stepped back together, side by side, and looked at the length of it. He ran his hand along the top rail, testing the smoothness, and nodded to himself. I realized I was doing the same, tracing the line with my palm. Standing there, I felt a strange satisfaction, not just in the work completed, but in having been part of it from start to finish. Inside, we cleaned up quickly, the day's heat settling into our shoulders. The hallway paint had cured overnight, and the surface was smooth under my hand as I passed. He gathered the tools into a single neat pile by the door, his movements deliberate. My husband had texted earlier to say he would be working late again, and I knew that meant the house would be quiet well into the evening. In the late afternoon, he suggested tackling the small repairs in the back room, a place I rarely entered except to store things we didn't use. Dust clung to the corners, and the single window let in a filtered, amber light. We moved a stack of old boxes to get to the baseboard, which had warped from years of moisture. Lifting the top box, I saw old photographs scattered inside, family gatherings, trips, faces from years before. I picked one up without thinking, and for a moment we both looked at it, not saying anything. Then he set the box aside gently, as if careful not to disturb more than the wood we had come to fix. We worked until the shadows lengthened across the floor. By then, the new baseboard was fitted neatly into place, the edges sealed. He packed the tools, looping the extension cord with the same precision he had when he arrived. Standing by the door, he glanced toward the hallway, his eyes resting briefly on the spot where we had kissed 2 days ago. I felt my breath hitch but didn't look away. The moment passed quickly, folded back into the rhythm of finishing the day. After he left, I walked through the garden alone. The trimmed path looked cleaner, more deliberate. The porch rail caught the last of the sunlight, its fresh wood pale against the older boards. Each improvement was something you could point to, but it was the changes you couldn't name that stayed with me, the subtle shifts in how I moved, how I noticed, how I waited for the next day's work. Inside, the back room felt different now, its corners less neglected. I thought of the photographs in the box and how they seemed to bridge a gap between then and now without asking permission. In the kitchen, I set the cinnamon roll bag in the trash, though part of me wanted to keep it, absurd as that was. It was just paper, but it had been part of this day, and lately I noticed I was keeping track of days in a way I hadn't before. When night fell, I turned off the hallway light and stood for a moment in the dark, listening to the faint creak of the porch settling under its new weight. The house felt solid, cared for. I wondered if that was how I looked now too, unchanged on the surface, but with something beneath that had been quietly reinforced. Tomorrow there would be more work, more reasons to be in the same rooms, more moments that could be explained as ordinary, even when they weren't. The next morning began with the sound of rain against the gutters, a steady, measured tapping that made the air in the house feel slower. I moved through the kitchen with a sweater over my shoulders, the floor cool under my feet. The tools we had used yesterday were still stacked by the back door, a silent reminder of work waiting to be finished. I checked the weather forecast on my phone, saw that the rain would clear by midday, and knew we would be working inside until then. He arrived carrying a plastic toolbox in one hand and a roll of painter's tape in the other, droplets still clinging to his hair from the walk up the drive. We didn't linger in the entryway. He set the box on the counter and began sorting through the contents: brushes, sandpaper, a small level, a utility knife. The plan was to start on the kitchen ceiling, where an old water stain had left a shadow no amount of cleaning could remove. He spread out a drop cloth while I cleared the table, stacking chairs against the wall. The ladder was set beneath the worst part of the stain, and I steadied it as he climbed, a tin of primer in his free hand. The smell was sharp when he opened it, and I stepped back, watching the roller leave clean, damp strokes over the discolored plaster. I followed with a smaller brush, edging carefully near the corners. The rhythm of the work made the space feel contained, the sound of rain fading into the background as the ceiling transformed inch by inch. By the time we finished the first coat, the rain had thinned to a drizzle, light enough that we could move outside to check the porch rail. The wood was still pale from yesterday's replacement, and he wanted to seal it before the weather could undo our work. We carried the sawhorses back into place, setting the sealant and brushes on top. The scent of wet earth mixed with the sharper smell of the chemicals as we worked side by side, following the grain in long, even strokes. The drops from the eaves slowed, each one landing with a sound that made the afternoon feel longer than it was. Back inside, the light in the kitchen had shifted. The stain was gone, the ceiling bright and clean. We both stood under it for a moment, looking up as if to confirm that the change was real. He began packing the brushes, wrapping the roller in plastic to keep it from drying out. I swept the floor, the bristles catching small flecks of dried primer and sawdust from the day before. Our movements felt in sync without needing to be planned. The afternoon's task was the final coat on the hallway walls. The paint had dried to a smooth, even surface overnight, and now it only needed the last pass to bring the color fully to life. He rolled the larger sections while I worked on the edges, the soft drag of the brush steady in my hands. We traded places halfway through, and as we passed, our shoulders brushed, just enough to notice, not enough to stop. Neither of us commented, but the pause between our movements carried a weight that had nothing to do with paint. When the work was done, we stepped back to see the whole hallway at once. The new color made the space seem wider, brighter, more deliberate. He leaned against the wall, arms crossed, and let out a quiet breath as if he were satisfied not just with the work but with the process of getting here. I realized I felt the same. The house no longer seemed like a series of separate rooms but a connected space we had shaped together. The sound of my husband's car in the driveway came later than expected. We had time to put away the tools and fold the drop cloths before the door opened. He stepped inside with his phone still in his hand, already speaking to someone on the other end, and gave a quick wave before disappearing into his office. The hallway we had just finished painting stood between us and him like a quiet, perfect secret. As the evening light faded, we moved to the kitchen for one last check of the ceiling. The primer had dried completely, leaving no trace of the stain. I stood on the ladder this time, touching the surface lightly with my fingertips, and he steadied it from below. When I looked down, his eyes met mine in the narrow space between the rungs. For a moment, neither of us moved. There was nothing left to fix in the room, yet neither of us stepped away. We kissed. It was not planned, not spoken about, not introduced by anything but the quiet of the room. It lasted only long enough for both of us to know it couldn't be undone. I stepped down from the ladder, my pulse quick in my ears. He turned toward the counter, reaching for the folded drop cloths, and I picked up the paint tray, pretending to check if it needed cleaning. We worked in silence for the rest of the cleanup, the kind of silence that doesn't come from a lack of things to say but from having too much. When he left that evening, the porch rail was sealed, the ceiling spotless, and the hallway complete. I stood in the doorway watching him walk down the path, the air cool and damp from the earlier rain. Inside, the rooms we had worked on felt different, not just because of the repairs, but because of what had happened while making them. Each space carried the echo of the day, the scent of fresh paint and something less tangible but just as present. I turned off the lights one by one, letting the house rest, knowing tomorrow we would find another project, another reason to keep working side by side. The day began without urgency, the sky a pale, cloudless stretch that made the air feel still. I opened the windows in the kitchen to let in the mild breeze, and the scent of the sealed porch rail drifted back into the house. The work from the past week had started to change not just the rooms but the way the house sounded, less echo, more presence, as though it had been listening to us. I made coffee and stood by the counter, trying to think only about what needed to be done today. He arrived a little later than usual, a paper bag of screws and brackets in one hand, a folded note of measurements in the other. His shirt was marked with faint streaks of sawdust, evidence of something he'd worked on before coming here. He set the supplies on the table, glanced briefly toward the hallway we had finished, then looked away. We spoke only about the next task, the sagging shelves in the living room, and it felt like a plan we both understood without needing to say more. The living room shelves had bowed slightly in the middle over the years, their weight uneven from books stacked 2 and 3 deep. We cleared them carefully, setting volumes in neat piles on the floor. Dust rose from between the spines, catching the light in thin ribbons. I wiped each board with a damp cloth while he examined the brackets holding them in place. A couple were loose enough to shift with a touch, and he began replacing them one by one. While he worked, I sorted the books into piles, not by title or subject, but by size and weight, to balance the shelves when we put them back. The order felt strangely satisfying, like giving structure to something that had been quietly chaotic for too long. The sound of the drill filled the room in short bursts, and every so often, he would step back, check the level, then adjust. His movements were deliberate, each one precise, the kind of care you give to something you want to last. When the last shelf was secured, we stood back together to test them, pressing lightly at the center to feel the firmness. No movement. He handed me the first stack of books, and we began replacing them, alternating between his pile and mine. We spoke little, but the rhythm of passing and placing was enough to fill the space. By the time the last book was set, the shelves stood even and steady, the line across their tops unbroken. Around midday, we moved to the back door, where the frame had begun to swell from years of humidity. The door stuck slightly at the bottom, requiring a push to open fully. He removed it from its hinges while I held it steady, then carried it to the sawhorses outside. The air smelled faintly of cut grass from a neighbor's yard. I watched as he planed the lower edge, long curls of wood falling to the ground in pale ribbons. The sound was soft but steady, each pass smoothing what time had made uneven. When the edge was even, we carried the door back together, lifting it carefully into place. The hinges slid back into position with a quiet click, and the door swung open and closed without resistance. I ran my hand over the lower frame, the fresh cut smooth under my fingers. He gave a short nod, as if confirming a shared satisfaction. The afternoon light shifted into the hallway, touching the walls we had painted days ago. We took a break, sitting on opposite ends of the kitchen table, the open windows letting in the faint sound of a lawnmower somewhere down the street. My husband had sent a brief message saying he would be out later than usual again. I set the phone face down on the table and let the silence stretch between us without trying to fill it. Later, we tackled the loose trim near the stairwell. It was a small job but fiddly, requiring patience to align the pieces just right. I held the trim in place while he secured it, the hammer taps muffled by the padding of the wall. Standing this close, I was aware of the shared focus, the way our movements matched without needing instruction. Once the last nail was set, I stepped back, and the seam between wall and trim was seamless again, the gap closed. It was then that the knock came, sharp, unexpected. We both turned toward the door. It opened before I reached it, and my husband's friend stepped inside. He had been here before, though never unannounced. He greeted me with an easy familiarity, then glanced past my shoulder into the living room, where the tools and open boxes still sat. His eyes moved quickly, taking in the shelves, the hallway, the sight of us standing close in the narrow space. There was nothing in his expression that could be called direct accusation, but something in the pause made the air feel heavier. He asked about the repairs, and I explained the shelves, the door, the trim. He nodded slowly, as though weighing the details. His gaze lingered a fraction too long, first on me, then on him, before he stepped back and said he would see my husband later. When the door closed behind him, the quiet felt different. He turned back to the tools, picking one up without comment, and I began gathering the scrap wood. We finished the trim in silence, each of us more aware than before of how the day had shifted. By the time the work was done, the light outside had turned gold, casting long shadows across the porch. He packed his tools methodically, making sure each piece was returned to its place. I stood in the doorway as he left, the faint sound of his footsteps on the path fading into the evening. Inside, the living room shelves stood solid, the back door swung easily, and the stairwell trim was smooth and whole. Yet it was the image of the friend's glance that stayed with me, the weight of being seen in a way that felt sharper than chance. The repairs were visible, but so was something else, something unspoken, balanced on the edge of being noticed. The morning after the unannounced visit felt heavier than the others, though the sky was bright and the air clear. I moved through the house early, opening curtains, letting the light touch the corners where the dust hadn't settled in days. The rooms we had worked on looked orderly, even proud, but I felt the tension still hanging there from yesterday. The image of the friend standing in the doorway, his eyes scanning the space, replayed in my mind more than once as I boiled water for tea. He arrived without his usual knock, stepping through the open front door with a quiet greeting. In his hands, a flat box of new hardware for the porch steps, the final part needed to finish them. His expression was calm but deliberate, as though we both knew the day's work would be more than just replacing old bolts. I gestured toward the back, and we carried everything outside. The steps had been loose for years, each one shifting slightly underfoot. He knelt on the grass, sorting the bolts and washers into neat rows on the wooden deck, while I swept away leaves from the treads. The smell of sun-warmed wood rose with each pass of the broom. The sound of the bristles and the faint creak of the boards were the only noises between us for a long while. We worked side by side without much talk, lifting each step, aligning it, securing it again. The new bolts slid into place cleanly, the wrench turning with a smooth, satisfying resistance. With every turn, the old give in the steps disappeared, replaced by a firmness that made each one feel trustworthy again. There was a quiet satisfaction in the way the work fit together, no wasted movements, no second guessing. By midday, the steps were finished, the boards aligned and steady. He stood back, wiping his hands on a cloth, and we both tested them with slow, deliberate weight. No shift, no sound. Just the solid feel of something repaired properly for the first time in years. I caught his small nod, the same one I had seen when we finished the hallway, and felt the familiar pull of that shared sense of accomplishment. Inside, we moved on to the small storage room off the kitchen, where the door had never closed properly. Years of uneven flooring had tilted the frame just enough to keep the latch from catching. He measured the frame, then began to shave down the door edge with a plane, the long curls of wood falling to the floor in pale spirals. I swept them into a pile, the scent of raw wood filling the cramped room. When the door was rehung, it closed with a quiet click, and I tried it twice more just to hear the sound. The change was subtle, but the ease of it made the room feel more complete. We stood there a moment longer than needed, both knowing the job was done but neither stepping away immediately. In the afternoon, we returned to the porch to seal the edges of the new steps. The sealant gleamed wet in the sunlight as we brushed it along the grain. The air was warm enough now that the scent rose quickly, sharp but clean. I worked on the lower boards while he did the upper, the rhythm of the brushes overlapping in a quiet, steady pattern. When we finished, I suggested checking the hallway paint one last time for touch-ups. Inside, the air was cooler, the light falling across the walls in narrow strips. We walked the length of the hallway slowly, scanning for any uneven spots. He pointed out a small patch near the baseboard, and I crouched to fix it with a fine brush while he steadied the paint tray above me. It was then, in that narrow space, that I felt the shift again, the same one that had been growing since the first day. The closeness, the shared focus, the sense that the rest of the house had faded away for a moment. When I stood, our eyes met without either of us looking away. We didn't speak, but there was no question in the air about what would happen next. We spent the night together. The sentence is short, but the weight of it carried through every hour until morning. When I woke, the light was thin, the kind that slips in before the day has fully arrived. The house was still, the kind of stillness that feels like it's listening. I moved quietly through the kitchen, putting on the kettle, letting the sound of water fill the silence. He emerged from the hallway, tools in hand, as though the day's work could start without anything needing to be said. We carried the toolbox to the porch, and I realized that the steps, the storage room, the hallway, all of it, looked finished now. There would be other repairs, other tasks, but the foundation we had been building all week felt both complete and fragile, as though it could hold as long as no one looked too closely. That afternoon, he packed his things with the same careful order he always used. The sound of the latch on his tool case was sharp in the quiet. He stood in the doorway for a moment before leaving, his eyes moving once across the hallway and the porch beyond, then back to me. There was no smile, no lingering gesture, just the kind of look that carries more than words. When the door closed behind him, I stood in the center of the kitchen, the kettle still warm on the stove. The house was quiet again, but it didn't feel the same. The repairs were real, visible, tangible. And so was the change that couldn't be measured in bolts or paint. The morning felt oddly unbalanced, as if the air in the house was carrying the memory of what had happened without my consent. I moved from room to room, checking the work we had done over the past week, running my hand along the smooth hallway walls, opening and closing the storage room door just to hear its clean click. Everything was in order, but it all felt heavier somehow, as though each improvement carried a quiet echo I couldn't remove. I wasn't sure if he would come today. The uncertainty had me glancing at the driveway more than once while I rinsed the breakfast dishes. When I finally heard the familiar sound of footsteps on the porch, I caught myself pausing in the middle of drying a plate. He stepped inside carrying his tool case, his expression unreadable but steady. We didn't acknowledge anything beyond the day's task, fixing the loose screen on the back door and replacing the worn weather stripping. We started with the screen. The metal frame had bent slightly over the years, causing the mesh to sag in one corner. I held the frame steady while he removed the old spline, the dull thud of the rubber strip hitting the floor each time it came free. The new mesh was rolled out over the frame, its clean, taut surface catching the light. He cut it with short, precise strokes, then pressed the new spline into place. The rhythm of the work was calm, deliberate, and oddly grounding. Once the screen was fixed, we moved to the weather stripping. The old foam peeled away in uneven strips, leaving behind a thin line of adhesive. I scraped it clean with a putty knife, while he measured and cut the new pieces. The adhesive on the fresh strips was tacky, clinging to my fingertips as I pressed them into the groove. When the door closed, it did so with a solid, cushioned sound, blocking out the faint hum of the street outside. After that, we turned to the garden gate, which had started sticking after the recent rain. The hinges were rusted, and the latch no longer aligned properly. He removed the old screws while I sanded the edges where the wood had swollen. The metal felt cool in my hands as I held the new hinges in place, the drill vibrating faintly through my grip as he secured them. When we tested the gate, it swung smoothly, the latch clicking shut with no resistance. We took a short break, standing in the shade of the porch. The air was warmer now, the kind of steady heat that presses into your shoulders. I could feel the pull of yesterday in the way we didn't quite meet each other's eyes, but also in the absence of hesitation in our movements. There was work to be done, and that gave the day its shape. Inside, the next task was repairing the loose trim near the kitchen window. The wood had pulled away from the wall slightly, leaving a thin shadowed gap. He pried it back gently, checked for damage, then secured it again with short nails. I held the trim in place while he worked, the hammer taps sharp but controlled. The seam disappeared once the paint was touched up, the line between wall and wood smooth again. The afternoon brought a small but necessary job, replacing the rubber pads on the bottom of the dining chairs. The old ones had worn away, leaving scuffs on the floor. I flipped each chair over while he attached the new pads, the smell of fresh adhesive faint but distinct. When the chairs were back in place, the floor felt quieter under them, the scrape replaced by a soft glide. We ended the day by sweeping through the rooms together, gathering stray nails, scraps of wood, and lengths of painter's tape that had been overlooked. The house felt orderly again, each space carrying the imprint of our combined effort. Still, I noticed how often I was aware of his presence without looking directly at him, how each time we passed in a doorway, the air seemed to shift slightly. As he packed his tools, the sound of my husband's car in the driveway broke the quiet. He glanced toward the door, then back at me. There was no rush in his movements, but there was an unspoken understanding that the day's work was done. My husband stepped inside a moment later, greeting us both before heading toward his office with a stack of mail. When the door closed behind him, I walked through the rooms again. The screen door was smooth, the garden gate aligned, the trim neat, the chairs quiet against the floor. Everything we had touched today bore the mark of care, but beneath it was the unspoken truth that had been there since the first day we worked together. By the time he left, the sun was low, and the shadows stretched long across the porch. I stood there for a while after he was gone, looking at the house as if from the outside. The repairs were visible, but they told only part of the story. The rest was tucked into the silence between tasks, in the way each day ended with more fixed than had been broken at the start. The morning began with the kind of stillness that feels like a pause in the middle of a sentence. I walked through the house with my coffee, noting each room we had repaired over the past days. The smooth hallway walls, the fixed shelves, the sturdy porch steps, each project had left behind its own quiet sense of completion. But today the air felt different, heavier, as if something was waiting to happen. I wasn't expecting my husband to be home much, he had mentioned meetings across town. That left the day open for more work, though I wasn't sure which project we would tackle next. When the familiar sound of the truck pulled into the driveway, I caught myself straightening the kitchen towel on the counter as if order could disguise anticipation. He stepped inside with his toolbox and a folded set of instructions. We began in the dining room, where one of the chair legs had loosened enough to wobble. He turned the chair upside down on the table, showing me where the joint had separated slightly. I held the frame steady while he applied wood glue, the scent sharp in the air. He pressed the pieces together, securing them with a clamp, the slow tightening of the screw handle making the joint flush again. We left it to dry and moved on. Next was the upstairs hallway light fixture, which had been flickering for months. I fetched the step ladder while he unpacked a new fixture from its box. The hallway was narrow, and as I steadied the ladder, the closeness made it difficult not to notice the sound of each small movement, the click of the screwdriver, the faint tap as the screws were set aside, the rustle of wires being aligned. When the light came on without a flicker, the warm glow filled the space in a way I hadn't realized was missing. In the early afternoon, we worked on the front door hinges. The door had developed a slight sag, causing it to catch on the threshold. He removed each hinge pin in turn, cleaning them before applying oil. I stood to the side, holding the door steady, the weight of it firm against my hands. The hinges slid back into place smoothly, and when we tested it, the door opened and closed without resistance, the sound reduced to a quiet latch. While he packed away the tools from the door, I suggested checking the small cracks in the kitchen wall above the window. They had been there since we moved in, hairline fractures that spread slightly each season. He mixed a small batch of filler while I cleared the counter. The putty knife moved steadily, smoothing over each line until it vanished into the wall. We both stood back to look at it, the repair almost invisible in the soft afternoon light. It was then that the knock came at the front door. Not the quick, even rhythm of delivery drivers, but a measured, deliberate knock. When I opened it, my husband's friend stood there again. His eyes moved past me into the house before I could speak. He greeted me briefly, then stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. He made some comment about seeing how the work was going, his voice light but his gaze sharper than his words. As we walked toward the kitchen, I could feel the way he was looking, not just at the repairs, but at the space between the two of us. He noticed the ladder still standing in the hallway, the open toolbox, the clamp on the dining chair. His eyes lingered for a moment too long when they passed from him to me. In the kitchen, he ran his fingers lightly over the newly patched wall, saying it looked better than before. I nodded, keeping my expression neutral. He didn't ask many questions, but each pause felt like one. The air seemed to compress with every passing second, the unspoken pressing against the edges of the conversation. After a few more polite remarks, he said he would see my husband later and made his way back to the door. He left without shaking hands, his expression unreadable. The sound of the door closing behind him was louder than it should have been. We stood in the kitchen for a moment afterward, neither of us speaking. The silence was thicker now, not from awkwardness but from the awareness of what had just shifted. I gathered the drop cloth from the counter and folded it, the fabric rough in my hands. He picked up the toolbox and closed it with a quiet click. The rest of the work was finished in near silence. We reassembled the dining chair, removing the clamp and setting it back in place at the table. The joint held firm, the legs steady against the floor. Upstairs, the hallway light glowed steadily as we passed it, the warm color casting soft shadows on the freshly painted walls. The front door swung without catching, the sound of the latch clean and even. By late afternoon, the tools were packed away, the rooms tidy again. He stood in the doorway with his bag over his shoulder, his expression giving away nothing, but his pause before leaving was enough to carry meaning without words. I watched him walk down the path until he disappeared from view. The house was quiet when I closed the door. I moved through each repaired space again, running my hand over the smooth kitchen wall, the steady front door, the even glow of the hallway light. Everything looked as it should, but the air held something new, an awareness that the repairs were no longer the only thing being noticed. The friend's glance had left its mark, and though nothing had been said outright, the possibility of questions felt closer now than it ever had before. The next morning felt strangely expectant, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. I woke before the alarm, lying still for a while, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator downstairs and the occasional creak of the settling house. My husband was already gone for the day, his absence leaving the rooms in a familiar kind of quiet. I went through the motions, making coffee, opening the blinds, checking the list of repairs we had discussed earlier in the week, but my attention kept slipping to the thought of the friend's visit yesterday. His presence still lingered like the echo of a footstep in a hallway. When the truck pulled into the driveway, I caught myself tightening my grip on the coffee mug. He stepped in carrying a small toolbox and a bundle of sandpaper sheets, his face set in the kind of neutral expression that offers nothing for others to read. We didn't exchange more than a few words before moving to the day's first task, refinishing the worn edge of the kitchen counter. The surface had dulled over time, the varnish thinning in places where it was touched most often. He began by taping off the edges while I cleared everything from the counter. The sound of the sandpaper against the wood was steady and unhurried, and the scent of exposed grain filled the air as the surface became smoother under his hands. I followed with a cloth, wiping away the fine dust before we applied a fresh coat of sealant. The finish glistened under the light, each stroke of the brush laying down a thin, protective layer. While the counter dried, we moved to the upstairs bedroom window. The frame had developed a draft, letting in a faint chill even on warmer days. He measured the gap, cut strips of new weather seal, and pressed them carefully into place. I held the frame steady when he adjusted the hinges, feeling the faint vibration of each turn of the screwdriver. When we tested it, the window closed cleanly, the outside air shut out with a muted thud. By midday, we were in the garage sorting through the old shelves along the back wall. Some of the brackets had bent under the weight of storage boxes, causing the boards to tilt forward. He removed the warped brackets while I sorted tools and hardware into separate piles. The clink of metal against metal echoed in the space, the smell of motor oil faint but ever present. We replaced the broken brackets with new ones, securing each board until the shelves stood level and solid again. When we came back inside, the kitchen counter had dried to a smooth, even finish. I ran my fingertips lightly over the surface, feeling the difference. He began gathering the tape and brushes without a word, and I sensed the same undercurrent in his silence that had been there since yesterday. It was in that moment that the sound of a car in the driveway broke through the quiet. My husband's voice followed seconds later, calling out from the front door. He stepped into the kitchen, his briefcase still in hand, and behind him was his friend. The friend's eyes moved quickly across the room, taking in the counter, the open toolbox, and the two of us standing there. My husband began talking about a delivery he had just received, setting his papers down on the counter. The friend stayed quiet at first, his gaze moving between us with a calmness that felt deliberate. Then, as my husband looked through the papers, the friend made an offhand remark about how quickly the house is changing. It was said lightly, but it landed differently. My husband looked up, his attention shifting between the two of us for just a beat too long. The moment passed, but not entirely. He asked a few questions about the repairs, his tone casual but his eyes sharper now. I answered each one plainly, keeping my voice steady. He didn't press, but something in his expression told me he was filing away details. The friend stood by the doorway, his posture relaxed but his presence filling the space more than it should have. When they finally stepped out to the porch to continue their conversation, the room felt both emptier and heavier at the same time. I began clearing the work area, stacking the brushes and sandpaper neatly, though my mind was far from the task. He returned from the porch a few minutes later, his gaze meeting mine for the briefest moment before he picked up the toolbox. We finished the last job of the day, the tightening of the stair rail, in silence. The rail had loosened at the base, and we worked together to secure it, his hands steady on the bolts while I held the post in place. When it was done, we both stepped back, the job complete, the rail firm under pressure. He packed his tools quickly this time, no lingering over the small steps of putting things away. At the door, he paused for only a second before stepping outside, the sound of his truck fading down the street. I stayed in the kitchen, my hands resting on the newly finished counter, the surface cool beneath my palms. Not long after, my husband returned from the porch alone. He didn't say much, only mentioned that dinner would be later than usual. But there was a new weight in his voice, one I hadn't heard in a long time. As he walked away, I knew something had shifted, subtle, but enough that the balance of the past weeks could not hold much longer. The house was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet now. The repairs were still here, solid and visible, but so was the thin, invisible line between what had been done for the house and what had been done for reasons no one had spoken aloud. The day's work was finished, but the sense of completion was nowhere to be found.